Welcome to Trinity Radio. I'm Braxton Hunter, and on the screen also with me is Jonathan Pritchett and Dr. Mike Licona, who we are excited to have here today. We are allowing Dr. Licona to respond, and we're going to interact with him a little bit too, on a podcast that was released by Alisa Childers, and in which she spoke about Mike's work, as well as her guest spoke about Mike's work and some criticisms of it. And so we're going to engage with those a little bit here. And we'll talk with Mike. We may even push back a little bit. But Mike, we are so happy to have you on the show today. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks, Braxton and Jonathan. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So we will not take too much time, but I want to start by saying you guys can say whatever you want about this. But from the Trinity Radio perspective, I want you to know, I think that Alisa has a wonderful ministry. I'm sure she's a very godly woman. And I know that it's true about Mike, that he's a godly man. And what he says and does, in my opinion, whether I agree or disagree with him, and I do disagree with them occasionally on some of the things we're going to talk about here, perhaps, but I have no doubt that he's doing what he thinks is the right thing as he's led by the Spirit. So I go into it hopefully with a spirit of love, and maybe we can all think these things through together. Is there anything you want to say on the outset, Mike, before we jump in?
I spoke at a conference with Alisa earlier this year. I didn't get to meet her. I don't think I've ever met her or communicated with her before. John West, I don't recall ever meeting him or even knowing about him. I mean, that's nothing bad about him. It's, he's in a different discipline than I'm in. And so I wouldn't be too familiar with him. But I'm sure that they're just great people, godly people. They're smart people. I'm sure their motives are absolutely pure in this. I just think they're misinformed.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And Jonathan, I guess we'll just jump right into this. So if you want to go ahead and cue up the video, we can go ahead and start looking at what was said and talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, just to set up the video, we are picking up after they have been discussing Peter Enns, and then they went into a discussion about West having a book that mentioned Andy Stanley, and a publisher, an evangelical publisher, refusing to publish it because he criticized Andy Stanley. And then he goes in from after discussing those two people into discussing Mike Licona. And that's the setup. I guess you linked the original video.
The original video is linked in the description, as well as a link to Mike's channel and West's site, his website. I didn't see a YouTube channel. The name of the video that we're responding to is "Why Are So Many Christian Leaders Caving to Wokeness and Secularism?" And that certainly causes us to perk our ears up. So now you know where to find it, Jonathan, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I just wanted to set that up so that you know that if you know anything about Peter Enns, is he pretty much mythologizes much of the Old Testament. And then Andy Stanley wants everyone to unhitch from the Old Testament altogether. Mike Licona doesn't really do either one of those things, but yet he begins this video by saying even more concerning, which I thought was strange, that Mike Licona would be more concerning than Peter Enns and Andy Stanley. Anyway, let's get into the video. And Mike, you just wave or yell whenever you want me to stop it, okay?
Okay.
Right. And so then even more concerning to me actually is someone who is named Mike Licona. And Mike Licona is at Houston Christian University, and he's done some great work in the past defending the historicity of the resurrection. But in the last several years, he's wanting to redefine inerrancy as what he calls flexible inerrancy. But let's get to the devil is in the details. Literally, he says that the gospel accounts are like Hollywood movies about, say, a biography of someone that's inspired by true events, but where the script writers basically change the facts, the situations, even the words of the major characters to fit whatever they are wanting to tell. This is not inerrancy. This is old style. I mean, this is Jesus Seminar Light. I mean, if people remember the old Jesus Seminar, where liberal theologians would vote on whether this was an authentic saying of Jesus, and if they didn't get a majority vote, that wasn't. I mean, this is what he's actually doing, down to the words of Jesus. Again, no one says that they had tape recorders, that everything verbatim, but the Christians have always believed that this is an authentic description, accurate description of what Jesus said. But that's not what Mike Licona is saying. Just one example that I think crystallizes it.
Hang on a second. You need to stop. So, yeah, let's just talk about some of what he just said there. In terms of being inspired by true events, I do mention something like that in one of my books. But so, you've got I've got a video recording of exactly what happened here, right? Or you have like a movie reproduction that says, all right, this is what happened. This is based on true events here, of which there's going to be a little bit of artistic freedom. And then you have another one inspired by true events. And that's a lot more flexibility involved in that than based on true events. And I'm just trying to create some kind of an idea of differences in flexibility here. And no one really takes the Gospels, or should take the Gospels, as this is the exact words of Jesus. That's just being naive. And I was like that at one time. I remember my first year, it was my senior year in college, and it was my final semester, and I took my first semester of Greek as an elective. And I can remember, after a couple of weeks, you learn how to pronounce it. And so I remember I was reading it once and pronouncing it out loud. I thought, wow, this is exactly what Jesus said. This is how it sounded. It's like, I was so naive, because Jesus is normally speaking in Aramaic, not in Greek, and also, the way we pronounce the Koine Greek today, there's debate over whether that's the way it even sounded. Plus, if you compare how Jesus says the same thing in the different Gospels, they differ somewhat. So these aren't the exact words of Jesus. They might come fairly close, but they're not the exact words. There's definitely paraphrasing that's going on.
Well, and Mike, I don't mean to break your flow, but on that point, I think Elisa says about the Sermon on the Mount that she thinks that there's paraphrase going on there. So I don't think that's an incredibly foreign concept on the face of it.
Yeah. And there is more than just mere paraphrasing. I mean, it looks like Matthew has even changed the location from the bottom of the mount, where Jesus probably gave that sermon, to the top of the mount. And most gospel scholars, especially those who have spent appreciable time in Matthew, acknowledge that Matthew has some artistic moves within his gospel. He does it with his genealogy. I mean, we can unpack this if you want, but he does it with his genealogy. He does it with the location of the Sermon on the Mount. He puts it at the top of the mount in order to, as Moses was at the top of the mountain and received the law of God, Jesus at the top of the mountain, and he's interpreting the law of God. So he's like a new Moses. There's a theme in Matthew that Jesus is a new Moses. So you have some small artistic moves like this, where even a location is changed. I could just go on and on. You have Matthew, he even displaces where the day on which Jesus cleansed the temple. So when you read the story in Mark, you have Jesus ride in on Palm Sunday, and he goes into the temple, but it's later in the day. So he just looks around, he and his disciples, and they leave. And then they go to the Mount of Olives. They spend the night there. The next day, they're headed back to Jerusalem. The next day is Monday. They're headed to Jerusalem. Jesus sees a fig tree. He's hungry, no fig, so he curses it. Then he goes into the temple complex, and he sees stuff going on of which he doesn't approve, so he cleanses the temple. This is Tuesday, cleanses the temple. He leaves the temple. I'm sorry, this is Monday. So then he leaves the temple complex. They go back to Mount of Olives. They spend the night again. Tuesday morning, he's returning to Jerusalem. They see the tree at that time, the fig tree that's withered and died. But Matthew, who has a tendency to simplify his accounts throughout the gospel, he does it on several occasions. Jesus rides in on Palm Sunday, goes into the temple, And Matthew conflates both temple visits, the Sunday and Monday, into one. Both have occurred on Sunday. So Jesus cleanses the temple on Sunday, not Monday. Then they leave. They go back to the Mount of Olives. They spend the night. Monday, he's returning to Jerusalem. He sees the fig tree, nothing on it. He curses it. And Matthew says immediately it withers and dies. So here he conflates two parts of the fig tree being cursed and died into a single one. So he actually changes the day in which the temple was cleansed. So you find these kind of moves, a lot of them by Matthew that's going on here, changes details. Now to say that we are, looking at this, the Gospels, and this is exactly, each Gospel is portraying exactly how things occurred, is just not the case. And we might want to think that they are, but if you read the stuff carefully, if you read these Gospels carefully, that's not what's going on. Now, let me say one other thing.
And I think that people who are familiar with your work probably already know this, but for anyone that's not, it should be said that in your book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? You walk through and show that a good reason to believe that some of these principles like displacement and spotlighting, I think you called one of them, and these are compositional devices that seem to be at play in a genre that either is the genre that the Gospels are written in, or one very close, shares affinities, I think you say, with those. And so the issue at hand is not that one of these Gospel authors is getting something wrong or lying, but rather that you just misunderstand, or we misunderstand what it is that they're trying to do within their genre and the way they were writing history within that genre. And that seems to me like pretty important to mention, because when it comes to, like, say, Genesis chapter 1, while there are some people who would call you a heretic if you looked at that differently, there are a number of theories about what's going on in the days of creation, all that sort of thing. And we're not saying about each other, we're not saying about those together, well, that makes the Bible a liar and that makes the Bible deceptive and all that. We understand that what we're disagreeing about, at least many of us understand, that what we're disagreeing about is what was the intent of the author in doing that. It doesn't mean that they're wrong or they're lying unless you're imposing your expectation of how to write history onto their motives. Similarly, when it comes to the Gospel authors, somewhere in this clip, it said, well, this sounds like there's a lie. It's lying. Well, it would be lying if Matthew wasn't working within the tools of his genre and expecting those things to be the people were aware of how that genre might have been written. And so I think that's really important to mention. So for viewers out there, you say, well, wait a minute, he is kind of denying that the Gospels can be relied upon for these kind of things. Well, it's important to understand that he's saying, if you look at it within the genre that it's written, these were the way, this may well have been the way that these things were written. Is that fair, Mike?
That's a very fair characterization of my view. Even J.I. Packer, who's one of the main scholars who crafted the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, he has said that the creation chapters of Genesis are quasi-liturgical celebration of the fact of creation, and not at all what we would have seen had we been hovering above the chaos of it all. And he says, were there two trees, tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden? He says, I don't know. Trees were symbols in poetry back then. He says, was there really a serpent in the garden? I don't know. He says, but the message that's being communicated is true there. So I come to the Gospels and say, do you want to interpret a parable, like a parable of the prodigal son or a parable of the Good Samaritan, as being everything about it historical, recalling historical events? You're making a bad move with genre there. So I think what some are doing is because the Gospels are ancient biographies of Jesus, they're assuming that ancient biography operated by all of the same rules as modern biography. And so that's a categorical mistake there.
Yeah,
now,
I think.
Go ahead, Pritchett.
Well, I was going to say, I think that anybody who wants to encourage people to read their Bibles is going to eventually, if they take you up on that, run into these issues of the differences in the Gospels. You wrote a whole book to sort that out. There's other ways of doing it, undesigned coincidence, harmonization, all of these kind of things. but everyone's trying to wrestle with the same question, because at face value, everyone says the plain reading of the text is one of those banner phrases we always hear. Well, okay. Well, if you take that plain reading of the text, it causes some problems with the different accounts. And so everyone's trying to wrestle with these things. And, I'm kind of a more is more person. So when I think, well, which model resolves the issue best, I take it on a case by case basis. So I'm not all in one camp or the other, but from a historical perspective, understanding the stylistic liberties that ancient writers were allowed to take for theological reasons, like with the example of John. Ben Witherington likes to say, you talk about the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain. People say, well, it's just the same sermon twice, but Witherington likes to say each of the Gospels has Jesus cleansing the temple, but they all have him do it once. So which is it, and some people try to say it's twice, or other people say, no, John is arranging it thematically. Braxton and I just had a conversation with a ultra conservative Calvinist Presbyterian, and he's was making the case that there's, much of John is symbolism and all of this stuff. So it's just scholars trying to wrestle with the things, and normal church people in the pews are going to run up against this when they start studying the Gospels in depth. And so everyone's trying to give them tools to be able to prepare for that, because the differences in the Gospels is nothing new. And what you can't do is just ignore it like some people want to do, or let it unravel your faith like others, like the Bart Ehrmans in the world do.
Yeah. Okay, Mike, you ready to continue, or anything else you want to say at this point?
Yeah, we can continue.
Gospels, you have, they give that Jesus says, really quoting Psalm 22. It's an amazing, Psalm 22 is an amazing prophecy of Jesus on the cross, where on the cross he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, in John, he gives some additional details. And so he doesn't give that. He says, well, Jesus said, I thirst. Jesus said both. But according to Mike Licona, John rewrote, my God, why have you forsaken me, as I thirst.
Right.
Now, that's not paraphrase. I mean, if we got 1,000 people in the room right here and asked them to, give, a paraphrase of my God, why have you forsaken me? I would wager not one would come up with I thirst. I mean, he's basically saying that you can't trust the accounts of the words of Jesus. No matter, he says he is, I trust it. And he has a conservative theological view about Jesus as a savior and biblical sexuality. But his approach to the Bible, once you start preaching that, is just, this is not evangelical Christian. This is not historic Catholic teaching or Eastern Orthodox teaching about the Bible. And yet, I know so many people and friends, including someone who wouldn't endorse the book because of this, who won't speak out about Michael Licona because of their friendship with him. And some are even giving him a platform for promoting views that are just, if it was anyone else, they'd recognize it was theological liberalism. And yet he has a platform to teach new generations of evangelicals, and I would say lead them away from the historic faith.
Now, let me start with this.
So there's a couple of things that were said there.
Okay. I wanted to start with the fact that we glossed over something just before, in which we were asking the question, is this Jesus Seminar light? And I wanted you to respond to that, Mike, because he's right. The Jesus Seminar assigns probabilities or likelihoods on whether Jesus said X thing. And he says, well, this is kind of what's going on with Mike. So I want you to respond to that, because apologists have certainly made space to respond to the Jesus Seminar. What do you say to that before we move on to this?
First, in terms of these compositional devices, the ones that I propose in my 2 books on gospel differences aren't really anything new. They're new to New Testament studies, to Jesus studies, but classicists for decades have acknowledged that this is what's going on in ancient biographies, that ancient biographers use these things. In my books, I talk about Theon and show how he prescribed that these kinds of things for writers to use them, and even says that these are used in every form of writing. And he mentions poetry, he mentions history, he mentions orators using these, and he says they paraphrase not only their own writings using these compositional devices, but also the writings of others. So, whereas, the average Christian reading this may not be familiar with some of these, classicists are well familiar with them. What I did was I applied them to say, hey, if we look at these differences in the Gospels through the lens of these ancient compositional devices, does that make sense? Do some of these things come into focus on why the differences exist? And yeah, it really does. Now, he's getting on me for this thing for the paraphrase and John, and says nobody would do anything like that. And I've really gone off the deep end. But I didn't come up with this idea. Dan Wallace did. And I think he's right with it. So he needs to take this up with Dan Wallace as well. And now I'd say I want to deal with this thing with Jesus' final words on the cross and get to this Jesus Seminar Light thing. But before we do, we've got to go back and talk a little about John's gospel. Now, since the early years of the early church fathers recognized that John was a different kind of gospel. And that's why Clement of Alexandria and Origen both refer to John as a spiritual gospel. When you come to evangelical New Testament scholars, they even agree that something different is going on with John's gospel. So you have Craig Keener, who is a Johannine specialist, has a phenomenal 2-volume commentary on the Gospel of John that focuses on historical issues. He says that all Johannine scholars acknowledge some degree of Johannine adaptation. Paul Anderson, one of the foremost, perhaps the foremost Johannine specialist in the world, has said that what we are reading in John often is a theological paraphrase when we are reading Jesus's words in John's Gospel. You have Darrell Bach, who says that John very often takes things that Jesus says and does implicitly in the synoptic Gospels, or as it's reported implicitly in the synoptics, and he recasts them as explicit sayings and deeds in John's Gospel. You have D.A. Carson. Nobody is going to accuse him of Jesus Seminar Light or of going towards wokeness or progressive Christianity.
He wrote the book on exegetical fallacies.
Yeah. And he talks about how what John does is he takes Jesus's words and he rewrites them as in his own idiom. And he says, John has rewritten the whole. I mean, that's huge right there. Then you have F.F. Bruce. Nobody's questioning whether he's a wolf among the sheep or hadn't gone woke or is a progressive or moving in that direction. And yet in the introduction to his commentary on John's Gospel, F.F. Bruce said that John has taken the Jesus tradition and has recast it as an expanded paraphrase, a translation of the freest kind, a transposition into another key, and so much more. Let me give you one other evangelical Johannine scholar who has commented on the differences with John and what John has done. He cites that the I am statements, okay, in John, which are a matter of debate. And for reason, the biggest one being before Abraham was, I am. Did Jesus actually say that? And with these I am statements, I say in my second book, Jesus Contradicted, on the bottom of page 44, I said, we can't at all rule out that Jesus made these statements. So I'm not saying he didn't make them. I'm saying you can't rule out at all that he made these. But with most Johannine scholars, I'm thinking, I'm doubting whether he made those. And here's why. We don't find those kinds of statements typically in the Synoptic Gospel. You find something like that once in a while, but there's a bunch of them in John's Gospel. You don't really see this kind of stuff in the Synoptic Gospels. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is pretty cryptic about his identity throughout. He tells demons, be quiet. Don't tell them I'm the Son of God. He tells his disciples, don't tell people about me right now, who I am, or, hey, don't mention the transfiguration until after I've risen from the dead. And you get to John, but then you get to John 8, and what does Jesus say? Before Abraham was, I am. A very clear claim to being deity. But then just 2 chapters later, the Jewish leaders come to him and they say, why do you keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. Well, wait a minute, just 2 chapters earlier, he's saying to the Jewish leaders that he's I am. And now they're asking him, why are you keeping us in suspense? Are you the Messiah? And how does Jesus answer? He says, I have told you. The works that I do, these testify to me. And you find these same works in the Synoptic Gospels. They are the works that point to him as the Messiah. They are the works that point to him as being deity. And so John has taken these, Blomberg says that John communicates the same thing that are said in the Synoptics, like, I am the good shepherd. He said there are 2 passages, at least in the Synoptic Gospels, that talk about Jesus being a shepherd. Could John have reworded things in such a way to say, I am the good shepherd, but he didn't actually utter those words? Blomberg says, don't know. But if Jesus did this, it would have been totally allowable for him to do it. Now, what about the Jesus seminar thing? Oh, by the way, one other thing Blomberg does. And again, Blomberg, evangelical, a Gospels scholar and a Johannine scholar. He wrote the book, The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel. And he appeals to the proposal by Rainer Riesner, who says that John has taken sayings of Jesus that we see in the Synoptics, not that John's taken them from the Synoptics, but it could be this is the way Jesus actually said things, and it's how the Synoptics report it. And then he recast them as the I am statements. And so Blomberg is totally open to that. Now, Blomberg talks about the rating system of the Jesus Seminar. And what they did was the Jesus Seminar, notorious for being leftist theologians, a small group too. They were very popular in the 1990s and about the first half of the first decade of the 21st century. Nobody gives them attention anymore because they're way out on the fringe of the theological left. But they had this rating system that they would consider each saying of Jesus, and if they thought Jesus actually said it, he really said these words, then they would drop a red bead into the bucket. And then, if the majority said red bead, they'd say, yeah, Jesus actually said this. If they thought that Jesus said something like this, then they would drop in a pink bead. If they said that Jesus did not say this, but he communicated the thought, that's kind of like what the I am statements, then they would give it a gray statement, even though they wouldn't say that about the I am statements, but that's kind of like what Rainer Riesner and Blomberg and some others are positing, perhaps. So if he didn't say the words, but he communicated the thought, the same thought, then it gets a gray bead. And if he did not communicate the words or the thought, well, then it got a black bead. So given that kind of a rating system, when we come to the Gospel of John, here's what Blomberg said about the sayings of Jesus. A little is red. A little is red. Much is pink. Some is gray, but nothing is demonstrably black. Let me say it again. Again, this is Craig Blomberg. Little is red, much is pink, some is gray, but nothing is demonstrably black. I think that's a fair-minded assessment of those kinds of things. So this is what Johannine specialists are saying about John's Gospel. So I find it remarkable, to be honest with you, that you have someone like John West and others who are accusing me of going in this direction and leading people astray. John, in his book, he's talking about the wolves among the sheep, accusing me to be like a wolf among the sheep by positing these things. Unfortunately, what that shows more of is that he is just not even aware of where even evangelical New Testament scholarship is on this stuff today. Because if he was, he'd be, this is like standard thinking amongst evangelical New Testament scholars today. Not only evangelicals, but the broad swath of New Testament scholars.
Yeah, it was interesting to me. Braxton gave a presentation on apologetics and evangelism at I think it was at New Orleans. And one of the scholars, I can't remember who you said it was, had remarked that he appreciated Braxton's presentation because it included New Testament scholarship. Do you remember who said that? Was that Bowman or?
I can't remember who.
But I think it was Kenneth Boa, maybe.
No, it was the guy. It was, and you're embarrassing me on the spot here. It was the gentleman who runs or used to run the conference. I think Ryan Putman does now, but
Bob Stewart.
Yeah, Bob Stewart. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyway, and that always resonated with me because I've kind of found the same thing, that a lot of these people that get into like cultural apologetics or apologetics or whatever, they don't read enough of New Testament scholarship, so they get vague ideas about, what what inerrancy means, what is permissible when you're doing hermeneutics and all of that, and they don't actually read a whole lot of conservative evangelical scholars like the ones you mentioned, and it becomes a problem when they say these things when they're the ones who are actually out of step with how people have reasoned with the Bible. And I personally find that as someone in the world of apologetics somewhat embarrassing, and I think that they spend more time reading New Testament scholars so they'd understand that all of this is in the wheelhouse. Like when you mentioned most of it's pink, they go on to concede, I think, the entirety when they get into the discussing. No one says that the Sermon on the Mount was only a 7-minute sermon. They acknowledge that it was all, probably paraphrased. But that's been standard forever, And what we get into from there is just to what degree. That's it.
Yeah, and now a couple of things here, Mike. Honestly, now we've been kind of indirectly, I'm not saying that either of these people, I'm sure they weren't thinking of us when they said this, but they called out your friends for not pushing you on this and kind of encouraging you in love to come back into the fold on these issues. And frankly, though I think that might come across as too dramatic for what I'm going to do, I do want to push back a little bit because I tend to sympathize a bit with this complaint. Because I want to know what Jesus really said, right? I want to know, maybe not to the degree that you said, well, I know that I'm saying this and sounds the way Jesus said it and all that, but I want to know that the words I'm getting are the words of Jesus. Now, if I can't get that for some reason, or at least I can't get it from John in the way that maybe more explicitly I can get it elsewhere, maybe that's the answer. But if I can't get that, then I have to bite the bullet and say, okay, well, that's just the way it is. I'm not going to deny reality. But I have to say, I think this resonates with some people in our audience, people in Elisa's audience, and perhaps the general Christian out there, if they heard, and that was chosen perhaps because it's such a stark contrast between my God, why have you forsaken me? And I thirst. Mm-hmm. He says, you could say that to 1,000 people. My God, why have you forsaken me? And they wouldn't think that I thirst is the paraphrase of that. Mm-hmm. Now, you've indicated that John is doing something interesting there. And of course, we know the thematic importance of water and light and thirst. And maybe you want to talk a little bit more about those things. But my question is, how can I know what Jesus actually said? Just to let anyone listening know, I think I'm a pretty conservative guy. When you talk about is the serpent in the garden real, and what J.I. Packer said and all that, I think there was a real serpent in a real garden, and the loudmouth, leather-lung, red-faced Southern preacher in me kind of awakens when I hear that sort of thing. So I do think that that's important. So speak to that. Can I know what Jesus said?
That's a good question. It really is. Let me think how the best way to come. I'll just start and maybe can adjust, midway through it. we can approach this theologically, or we can approach it historically. I like to approach things historically. That's just my preference on things. If I'm approaching it merely as a historian, then I'd say, well, I think there are instances in which we can know, generally speaking, the gist of what Jesus said on that. Again, we're reading it in Greek. He most likely spoke in Aramaic on a lot of occasions, and even the Gospels report words differently, the words of Jesus differently, slightly differently. Like, just read the accounts on the Sermon on the Mount. Did Jesus say, blessed are the poor in spirit, like Matthew reports, or did he say, blessed are the poor, as Luke reports? The Beatitudes, that they come across as Matthew has it or as Luke has it, because they're different. They're just blessed, 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 blessed in Matthew, but it's blessed, but woe to those. Blessed, he's got all these, a few blesseds and then a few woes. So what's going on there? I mean, there's a little more than just paraphrase that is going on. So which one did he say? Oh, I don't know. I don't know the exact words of Jesus, but what I do trust is that the Jesus tradition would have been passed around by Jesus' disciples, the eyewitnesses, and those that, like the gospel authors, I believe that their sources are very closely rooted in eyewitness testimony. So in that case, I think we're getting the gist of what Jesus said. It's kind of like the modern reconstruction of the famous liberty or death speech by Patrick Henry. Very dramatic speech, but the reconstruction of that speech is based on two eyewitnesses who heard that speech 40 years earlier. They did not take any notes at the time. We don't know if Patrick Henry given that same speech anywhere else, and no notes from his speech from Henry himself had survived, if he even had any. So, of course, most of that speech is a dramatic reconstruction based on some historical kernels that the two eyewitnesses recalled 40 years later. I think that the teachings we have preserved of Jesus in the Gospels are far more reliable constructions of what Jesus actually said than the reconstruction of what Patrick Henry said 40 years later. The fact is that Jesus was an itinerant preacher, so he would have preached the same stuff countless times. The disciples would have heard it, and then they went out because he sent them out in twos. They went out and countless times heard it or preached it. And then they came back, they would have debriefed with Jesus, they would have continued to preach. And then after he left for several decades, they're preaching the same things about his teachings all the way up until the time the Gospels were written. And there would have been a community type remembrance among the apostles with this. So look, I don't remember President Trump's State of the Union address that happened 4 months ago. I don't remember it. I hardly remember anything. I don't know if I remember anything about it at this very moment. But, the thing is, they're writing about Jesus' recollections like 20 to 65 years later, but they would have been preaching about it daily during all that time. So yeah, they're going to remember it.
Yeah, because you're saying, like my wife who traveled with me for years, preaching in churches and hearing some of the same messages over and over and over and over. She could preach. A lot of pastors say this. She could preach my sermons just as well as I could because she's heard them so many times. And then, like you say, going out and preaching those messages and coming back and having debriefings with Jesus, which would be likely, and all that sort of thing. Well, okay. Now there's a super chat here, but I want to push a little more because here's the problem, Mike.
Yeah, I do want to, at some point, I do want to talk about the last sayings of Jesus on the cross, but go ahead, because I haven't gotten to those.
Well, go ahead and do that because my question is going to relate to that.
Okay. So, all right, these statements are in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So when you go to Matthew and Mark, they report the same final two statements of Jesus. So his penultimate statement is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then, which they say in Aramaic was, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Okay. Now, the people who weren't Jews at that time that are around the cross, they hear this Eli, Eli, and they say, hey, I think he's calling for Elijah. Let's see if Elijah will come to save him. And they take a sponge, they dip it in sour wine, and they put it on a reed and they lift it up to Jesus. And when it gets up to his lips, he yells out with a loud cry and breathes his last. Okay, so that's Matthew and Mark's recollection of what happened. My God, why have you forsaken me? And then a loud cry, and he dies. You come to Luke. Luke doesn't mention a penultimate statement. He mentions his final statement as being, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And you say, okay, well, that is different than a loud cry. Well, maybe someone will say, yeah, well, that's what he cried out. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. That's possible. I think it's doubtful, though, since Matthew and Mark have both articulated those words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why would they just say he cried out with a loud voice and died? But nevertheless, let's go on to John. John gives a penultimate and then an ultimate statement. His penultimate statement is, I thirst. And then at that point, they fill a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, lift it up. He takes part of it a little. And then he says, it is finished. And he bows his head and breathes his last. Okay, that's a little different. The reason they put the sponge up to him is different in John. Now, I thought Dan Wallace's proposal was reasonable. And I said, this could very well be what happened. He's communicating the thought. What is the first thirst thing? Well, Dan says that when the word thirst is used in John's gospel, and I looked, and this is the case, it is referring to things like thirsting for God, thirsting for light, for truth. Here, what is the term, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is thirsting for God at that point. He's feeling this, like he's forsaken by God, and he's thirsting for God. So to say I thirst does communicate the thought of what Matthew and Mark are communicating of Jesus there. And then what about the final statement? It is finished. We've heard it in so many sermons on a Sunday morning. If you read the commentaries, what does it mean it is finished? It means Jesus has finished. He has completed his mission on earth, and he has paid in full for our sins. That's what it is finished means. Well, that's quite different than into your hands, Father, I commit my spirit. So what the words that Jesus actually say there, I don't know. I would probably tend to go with Matthew and Mark here. If I was a betting man, if I had to bet on it, I was forced to bet on it, I'd say Matthew and Mark. But what about what Luke and John have? I don't know. Maybe they fit in there somewhere. And during the crucifixion, and Luke and John just put him in at a different spot. I tend to think that John has paraphrased here. Remember what Bruce said. He called it an expanded paraphrase, a translation of the freest kind, a transposition into another key, and so much more. So I don't have problems with Dan Wallace's proposal here. John may, and maybe Dan's wrong. I don't know.
Yes, he is. But can you?
It's not heretical, though.
No, I absolutely agree. I was going to save that line when they're like, his friends need to say he's dangerous, and no, you're not dangerous. And Wallace isn't dangerous. Just wrong on this. And I wanted to ask you first. Can I get you to explain to to our audience what the device of telescoping is?
Telescoping is when you, this is a device that is used by New Testament scholars at times to say, you're kind of like speeding up of when an event actually occurred. You're making it occur quicker than it actually had. Now, classicists refer to that as compression, where you compress the time. And I actually prefer their definition of it. I think it more accurately describes what's going on.
It's a condensing of events to where you're getting to the point, essentially.
That's right. Matthew he telescopes the cleansing of the temple. He moves it to a closer time than it actually occurred.
Right. So I find that idea helpful, this idea of condensing, because we know that Jesus wasn't on the cross for 5 minutes. He was on there for a while. And I think that it is more likely to me that Jesus probably said something along these lines at some point, and they just kind of all put it towards their climax. And I think that that's possible.
Well, now, Richard, this plays into a criticism I had, and you can respond to this, Mike. When I'm listening to you talk about this, I think to myself, okay, now, I believe there are compositional devices. I also believe that sometimes harmonization is the right way to go. And to my understanding, you agree with that. Mm-hmm. I would say what someone in the chat has said, and I've lost it here, but someone had said a while ago, that I agree with Mike about all that. I just don't think the compositional devices are used as liberally as what he does. And so here's the thing about this. If I have to choose between compositional devices and harmonization in a situation, I have to make a judgment call. But on a case like this, the fellow in the video, John West, he says, well, Jesus said all of these things. And frankly, I'm kind of sitting here going, wait a minute. If I have two options in front of me, one requires me to say, I'm not sure exactly that I do know what Jesus said. If that's true, I have to bite the bullet, like I said before. But on the other hand, it could be that we're very familiar with the notion that one gospel may not report something that the others do. And your idea here, or it's not your idea, but Wallace's idea here, seems to require that, or part of the evidence for it seems to be that, well, look, this happens, and then you get the sponge, basically, right? Mm-hmm. And then in another gospel, this happens, and you get the sponge. But if you already accept things like this displacement, moving things around a little bit, I don't know how much force that has using some of those very compositional devices. So I find myself sitting here going, I just think he said all of those things. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but what is your pushback on what Jonathan and I have said about that?
Well, you could be right. Maybe he did say all those things. I don't.
We're trying to run a YouTube channel here. You got to be a little more aggressive than that.
Look, I'm a historian. I look at these things. I'm not doing this necessarily for apologetic purposes. I'm doing it because I'm trying to figure this stuff out. I'm trying to read the text and try to figure out what actually happened in the past. I'm not doing this as a theologian. Okay.
Yeah.
So I as a historian, I got to say, I don't know. I look at the possibility and I say, yeah, maybe he said all those things. Maybe Matthew and Mark placed those two things there, but Jesus said them at different times. That's possible. That said, I think in this case, given how John does things on different occasions, and as all these Johannine specialists, evangelical New Testament scholars have already observed about John. Here's another thing about John. One more thing. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, says that Jesus, I think Mark, maybe it's Matthew, says that Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables, and he never spoke to them outside of parables. It was Matthew that said that. Well, that's hyperbolic, of course, because in the same gospel, Matthew reports Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount, and he's not using parables in that, right? So, but Matthew is definitely saying that Jesus spoke a whole lot in parables. Not once in John do we find a parable. So there's stuff going on in John, and if John is taking some liberties in the way that he's saying things as an expanded paraphrase, a transposition into another key, this looks like a very good example of that to me, of what Jesus is saying, or Jesus is saying in his last two statements on the cross. In terms of what to go with as your default, do you go with harmonization or do you go with compositional devices? I agree with you, Braxton, that you can do it on a case-by-case basis. I do think that harmonization is preferable at times. I think the prime example for me is Jesus before Pilate. And the whole thing about Barabbas. I think harmonization is perfectly responsible way to go there in that instance. But when you see the compositional textbooks by people like Theon and Quintilian and Hermogenes and others, and they are prescribing, do these things, to paraphrase when writing, change a statement to a question to a command, create a dialogue, amplify with other details and things like this. And then you see Plutarch using additional devices. It's like, okay, this is common practice in the ancient world for writing biography. If the gospel authors are doing this, we shouldn't be surprised. I think we should be surprised if we did not see them doing it. So that's how I think that as a default, the compositional devices, if anything's the default. But I do think that there are times when harmonization is preferable.
Well, it seems like you can use a compositional device to harmonize as well, which is what I'm suggesting, because it seems to me, but like thematically, I don't have a problem with that, because Matthew wants to call attention to Psalm 22. And I think the way I understand the New Testament use of the Old Testament, I see that as Jesus calling attention to the whole of the psalm. I think Augustine's right here that the I thirst statement, John is wanting to call attention to Psalm 69, especially verse 21, and that Jesus is fulfilling these scriptures. And that's the point that John wants to make, so that the scripture would be fulfilled. He changes the reed to uses hyssop to echo his Exodus imagery that he's used elsewhere in chapter 18 and chapter 19 with respect to the Passion. So I don't have a problem saying that they're doing all of these for theological reasons and so forth, but and they're using compositional devices. But it also seems like in that you do find some ways of harmonizing all of this because of the composition devices and understanding the literary devices and the genres of the Gospels. I'm with Witherington that the idea that they're all, we just say Greco-Roman biography without,
Yeah, you can do both, like you say, in the same thing. I just think to me it sounds in this case with the crucifixion and the sayings there, it sounds to me, I might be wrong, it just sounds a little ad hoc. And one of the things that leads me to that, Jonathan, is when you look at Jesus's passion, start in the garden, okay? And Plutarch talks about ancient biographies being portraits, okay? They're portraits. They are illuminating the character of the person. And you read through Plutarch's lives and the lives of others, and that's exactly what's going on. They are using the deeds and words of others to kind of illuminate who this person is, the kind of person they are. Now you go to the Gethsemane, where in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is really wrestling with this thing. And he's saying, Father, if at all possible, let this cup pass from me. Okay, he's wrestling with it. And then he's on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He is really struggling with this stuff. You come to God, to John's gospel, and in Gethsemane, he's not really struggling too much. And you don't find him wrestling with this stuff like you do in the Synoptics. And instead of saying, let this cup pass for me, when Peter lops off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest, Jesus says, sheathe your sword. Shall the cup that the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? And then when he's on the cross, there's no, my God, why have you forsaken me, or anything like that.
Well, but again, in Matthew's gospel, you have Jesus wrestling with this idea in the garden, but yet he does say that he does call attention to Psalm 22. And in the entire context, as you read down through it, it says, and he did not turn his face from him, because the whole point of the Psalm is vindication, and that God was with the righteous. So it seems to me that even in that one gospel, the idea there is not, well, Jesus is struggling and then he feels forsaken at the end. It's really, I think Psalm 22 turns it around from the garden for Jesus. And that's within the same gospel. And then when you get to Gospel of John, you have him saying, I thirst, John's trying to call attention to Psalm 69, which is a similar thing where they're up against, God's chosen. And so it seems to me that I, even within Matthew, and then both Matthew and John, they seem to be more united than different. At least thematically.
Yeah. Thematically, that's there. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me jump in here and say we have a super chat here, a question that is sure to be provocative, but I want to say before we I want to lower the stakes from my perspective a bit. The fact about this is there's nothing, no written document that we should be more cautious about, but yet I want to remind everyone again of what we said a moment ago. Like it'll come up in a moment about Matthew chapter 27. So maybe I should wait to talk about that until it's raised. But what Mike is saying is again, that it's not, if Mike is right, it doesn't mean that the gospel authors are wrong or that they're lying at all. It means that they were intending to write their history in a different way than your assumptions led you to, or the way that 21st century history is written. It doesn't mean they were wrong. It doesn't mean what they were.
Under the inspiration of the Spirit too. They're doing that in their day with their conventions under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to do it the way that they did it. That's
right. And so that's fair. But so I don't think that this is I don't think that what you're saying is as dangerous as people are acting like. But there are some people who have concerns, and so here's
hang on a second. Let me just say one thing that I skipped. When John West says, he's wondering why people aren't confronting me on this, why my friends aren't confronting me on this. I can say this. One of the reasons is because a number of them agree with me. Another reason is because they find the ideas that I'm expressing, articulating in the book, to be of interest, and they want to mull over these because they need time for the ideas to marinate so that they can think about them. I think that's where Sean McDowell is. So it's not that they're afraid to confront. Look, anyone who knows me, you guys know me. I don't bite. Anybody can come to me. Colleagues are definitely always welcome to come. Look, you mentioned the Matthew 27 and the raised saints. I can tell you this, that when that was going on back in 2011, Craig Keener and Darrell Bach both called me, and they wanted to talk to me and convince me that of my view being wrong on how to interpret the raised saints, and they were great, and I welcomed their calls. I knew that they loved me, they cared for me, they did things the right way, and that was a tough time, to be honest with you. And very honestly, I wanted to change my mind. Yeah. It would have been kind of in my best interest at that time to change my mind. But I had to be honest to my own thoughts and where my research was. And even if I was wrong, I still remain convinced of where I've landed with Matthew's raised saints. But they're not always afraid. I just don't think that a lot of people, they either agree with me or they're not sure. But it doesn't seem that at least my colleagues, the broad colleagues throughout the apologetics and New Testament world, scholarship world, they're not alarmed by this stuff.
Yeah, that's the thing I wanted to highlight, because I wonder if they think that I'm even worse, because even though I probably agree with you on, 90% of everything, I don't agree with anybody on everything, but it's like I have no problem saying you're wrong, but I also have no problem saying you're not scary or dangerous, because this is nothing to be alarmed
about. And also,
about.
He might beat you in a debate on the subject for sure.
No,
but look, let's get back to this, because first of all, I want to attest to what you just said. You've always been a very gentle, very charitable, loving guy. Just recently, we were together at a conference, and my daughter was there. My 13-year-old or 14-year-old now daughter was there.
He's great.
And you sat there, and this is what Mike said. Mike stopped me after about 5 minutes of us talking, and he looked at her and he said, me and your dad are going to catch up a little bit here, but then I want to know more about you. And she walked out of there saying, Mike Licona is my bestie. And so it was just the greatest thing ever. You've always been so sweet, and I have no doubt that you want to do what's right. But here's a comment that someone leaves. I'm just going to read it to you and let you react. All right. Question: Geisler, the McGrews, John West, and many others have said this about Mike Licona. So is it possible, in Mike's mind, it sounds like it is, that he might be, that he might kind of be like wrong, I guess. Even Ehrman said Mike was more in his camp. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I could be wrong. I don't think that I am.
You don't have Cartesian certainty that you're right?
No. What I can say is one thing that I'd learned when I was doing my doctoral research. Anybody who knows me, and I think, anybody who knows me knows that I've had times when I've struggled with doubts. And the reason being, it's just the way I'm wired. And something is as important as the eternal destiny of my soul. I want to make sure I get this right. I want to do my best to get it right. And that means facing the stuff, the difficult questions with genuine, authentic research for truth, wherever it leads. And yes, I believe that the Holy Spirit has revealed to me that Christianity is true. But I have to acknowledge that people of other religions believe that God has revealed to them that what they believe is true. So it's like, okay, well, how do I know that I am really being fed the truth by the Holy Spirit here? And I think the only way, at least in my mind, to be certain of that is to, or to have a reasonable amount of confidence, is to look at the facts objectively. And so I've developed, since my doctoral research, this habit of trying to look at things as objectively, as open-minded as possible, without starting with any kind of presuppositions that what I already believe is true. And so when I come to this and I look at the Gospels this way, our view of Scripture, here's the thing I teach to my students, our view of Scripture should be consistent with what we observe in Scripture. And since Norman Geisler came after me back in 2011 and following, and I got ostracized from a bunch within the Southern Baptist community. It's like, I had several people call me, leaders, and say, Mike, you're going to find that Christianity, even conservative Christianity, is a lot more broader than Southern Baptist and some of the evangelical world. And I have found that. So while some evangelicals, like maybe John West and Elisa Childers and the Geislers and the not McDowells, I'm sorry, the McGrews, they don't like the stuff that I've promoted. Okay, they're right to have their opinion. I don't believe they're right. I know that I've spent a whole lot more time wrestling over this stuff than they have on it. And I know that there are a lot of scholars who agree with me on this stuff. So could I be wrong? Yes. I don't think I have. I mean, I've looked in depth at Lydia McGrew's work. I spent 3 months going through her book, The Mirror of the Mask, very carefully and looking at it. And then I responded with 8 videos that anybody who's interested can view them on my YouTube channel. Answering Lydia McGrew is the playlist name. So could I be wrong? Yes. But
well, Mike, why
they don't think they are. I don't think I am.
Yeah, Mike. How dare you think that you're right in what you think, Mike? But no, seriously. Well, I completely forgot what I was going to say.
By the way, I know what I was going to say. 8 pages of emails that have been sent to me over the last year from people that bought and read Jesus Contradicted. 8 pages of emails I have saved that have come through our website of people thanking me for the book and saying how it has really, really helped them and restored their confidence in the gospel.
It helped me and gave me confidence not only in the gospel, but also in my own self-importance, because you mentioned me in the notes there at the beginning. But no, I know what I was going to ask you, Mike. Why do you think it is? Like you've mentioned all these scholars that you say are, they're understood to be theologically conservative scholars, and yet they either agree with you or are not closed-minded about your view. Why do you think you get singled out? Like often you get brought up with this stuff as though you're progressive and all these kind of things. Why is the reason for that?
Braxton, if you can ever figure that out, please tell me. I don't know.
I know. I have it figured out.
Tell me.
Okay. New Testament scholars are boring and dry as dust and don't speak as often in public on defending the faith as you do. And since you have a platform to where you're more in churches helping equip Christians to wrestle,
and is a dynamic speaker
and very entertaining to watch, you're obviously going to be a target. That's the beginning and end of that, is that you speak in public more because people would rather listen to you than boring New Testament scholars. And that's not a knock against them. I love boring New Testament. I live for their lectures. But if I'm sitting in a church, I would rather it be something, from like Lycona. Oh, Daryl Bach's pretty entertaining. So if I can get past his Calvinism, he's all right. Ben Witherington's pretty entertaining. I love his Southern accent. So, there are exceptions, but in general, you're out there speaking a lot and you are bringing these ideas into local churches. And I think because people lack familiarity with all of the receipts you brought earlier from conservative scholars, because we just don't do scholarship in the church like we ought to, it jars them because they're not used to hearing it, even though their pastors, if they have seminary training, engages with Carson's commentary on John, and every John class is like a standard. They've all read J.I. Packer's work, just in their private devotionals or whatever, but they don't communicate all of this stuff in the corporate service in their preaching to explain these ideas as they come up, if they're preaching through the Gospels or whatever. So I think that is exactly why you get the biggest target on your back.
Well, that could be. I agree with you that some of these other guys are decent speakers. I'm out there in public eye more than they are typically,
yeah.
Whereas a lot of them are in their ivory towers more than I am. So, yeah, I never thought of that before, but I think you make a good point, Jonathan.
Okay.
It does. Now, there is something,
Matthew 3 for you.
Yeah, Matthew's, really, I've wondered that and said this to Gary Habermas and my wife for years. Why are they always coming after me? Why aren't they going after these others? And I don't know. But I think you've made more sense of this than anything else I've heard. I do wonder.
I say every day when I come out of Pritchett's office.
I do wonder why they didn't come after Bill Craig when it came to Matthew's Raised Saints. When I wrote about that and adopted that position in my big book on the resurrection, I was not aware that Bill Craig had said that in his debate with John Dominic Crossan years earlier, more than a decade earlier, and that it's in the book. Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up? Edited by Paul Copan. So Bill Craig took that position. As far as I know, he still takes that position. And other New Testament scholars take that position, but people don't go after Bill on that. But they like to come after me on it.
Well, yeah, I think you're wrong, and I don't come after you on it, because I remember during the Geisler thing, I was like, why is this a big deal? It was beyond me. So I was like, I don't think Mike's right about that. Maybe, but probably, I always think I'm right about everything until someone changes my mind. But it's like, I did not understand the Chicken Little mentality that you're all going to become a bunch of woke leftists listening to Presbyterian lesbians at the PCUSA church or become atheists because Mike Lycona thinks that Matthew 27, 51, and 53 is weird. Okay, so what? You don't have to agree with him, but there's nothing like scary about it. And it doesn't follow that, well, if you think in these kind of categories with respect to New Testament documents, therefore apostasy is next. I don't know where that, but if there are places on the internet where Mike Lycona led me out of the faith, I'd be curious to talk to those people, because I don't know that they actually exist.
Well, let's get on to a little more of the video. We're almost done with what is said about Mike, but there is at least one more thing I want to get to, and probably more that Mike wants to get to. So let's get trucking, John.
Okay.
Almost all the.
So you're going to lead people to apostasy, and then they want you to buy burgers. So there's an ad here in the middle
Good Ranchers does not yet support this program, but we're looking at you,
Almost
Good
all
Ranchers.
the meat that we eat in our home comes from goodranchers.com.
Yeah.
And one of my daughter's favorite comfort meals is to take the
You're
Better Than
literally
Organic
gonna play
chicken
the
breast.
commercial.
I think we are at a very similar. That's why I brought up Spurgeon with the downgrade controversy. You have J. Gresham Machen with the battles they had there, and then of course at Westminster the battles they had over Pete Enns. Because and the reason I brought out that about Pete Enns is because Pete Enns was a conservative Bible scholar at the time. And nobody would have thought that this would be coming from inside our ranks. And I think the thing that is hard, the hardest thing, it's easy to call out people that aren't in your camp. It's easy to call out what you see outside of your camp. And it's hard, and it takes a special kind of courage to do it within your own camp. And that certainly doesn't mean you put someone on blast and question their salvation or anything like that. But there has to be accountability within the group. So what we're seeing now happen with this proposed redefinition of inerrancy from Licona is coming from within the apologetics community. And I was recently at an event where I sort of alluded to this, and I quoted that quote from President Peter Lilback of Westminster because for me, again, I'm not a scholar, but I can look and see the effect this is going to have on the average Christian. When my faith was in shambles and I learned principles of hermeneutics, when I learned the doctrine of inerrancy, it all made sense to me. Things like, hey, when we're talking about inerrancy, we're not saying that there aren't any paraphrases. Obviously, Sermon on the Mount, it takes about 7 minutes to read that. It was probably longer than that. So it might be condensed in a bit of a paraphrase, but everything that you read in the Sermon of the Mount is what Jesus said. There's a difference between that and putting words in Jesus' mouth that he did not say. That is going to have cataclysmic effects on the faith of young.
Now, wait a minute. Summarizing Jesus's teachings, and then, that he's probably said in Aramaic, and then, he might have spoke Greek to the centurion, but summarizing his speeches is literally putting words in his mouth. That's literally what it is.
And what if John is doing some of the moves that most Johannine evangelical scholars say that he's doing? Well, yeah, they're kind of putting words in his mouth, but it is a different kind of it's a different kind of biography. It's a different kind of genre. It's kind of like the difference between a photograph and a portrait. So both are truth, but they're different kinds of truths. One is a very precise truth. The other is to summarize the kind of person this is. You see a portrait of George Washington standing there with his right hand on his hip. That's to show an air of command, of authority. But if you see a battle going on in the background, well, that's not really the way it happened. He's not taking time out of commanding a battle in order to stand for a portrait. That is to talk more about the kind of person he was and what he did. You wouldn't say that they're lying by doing that in a portrait. Well, it didn't happen that way. You understand that that's a portrait. Well, what you're doing, what Elisa is doing, is she is taking her thoughts of what 21st century biography is like and importing it back into what she thinks first century biography was like. She's confusing the two. And so if John was allowed to do these kinds of things, then why is that wrong? It might be wrong if you're talking about 21st century biography, but that's not what John is.
Yeah. All right.
Young people that can't necessarily be confident with that when they read something Jesus said, that he actually said it. And I don't think you're exaggerating to say it's Jesus Seminar Light. Now, of course, there are debates, and there are some people who have kind of quietly spoke. There's like Lydia McGrew has spoken out quite fervently, and there are some who've endorsed her. But I want to see more people even pulling their friend aside to say, look, this is not okay. This is not going to work. And again,
Dr. Licona, what you're doing is okay, and you're right unless you disagree with me. I wonder if that'll suffice. Who knows? All right, we'll let her finish.
Yeah.
So it is. We are here again. And I want to just encourage my viewers and listeners to think about parsing categories this way. To say that somebody is proposing something dangerous, you're not saying they're a bad person or that everything they believe is terrible. I've been thankful for some of the work of Mike Licona in the past. I think he was very clear, like you said, on the resurrection in spots. Although, again, I think it started back then because that's when he was redefining part of the genre of Matthew to be apocalyptic literature, which would say that the people who rose from their tombs after Jesus was resurrected, that didn't really happen. And that was sort of the beginning of this. And I remember reading his book, Why Are There Contradictions in the Gospels? And at first I was kind of excited about
differences in the Gospels. Why are there differences?
Yeah. Oh, she got the title wrong. Okay.
But that was nice. That was nice of her to say those things. That is nice. But go ahead.
I'm trying to get my head around the danger. It reminds me.
Well, on the surface of it, Jonathan, it really does. Like getting in the head of the kind of people, a lot of the people that we minister among. If they hear, well, that Jesus might not really have said that without any context. Just on the face of it, that sounds horrific, right? It doesn't mean Christianity is not true. It doesn't mean that that's not the meaning. John may be trying to give you the thematic important gist or whatever, as Licona said.
Well, this is you've obviously, Dr. Licona, read a lot of academic commentaries across the spectrum, but even the conservative commentaries on Matthew's gospel. Now, was there ETS blew up over Gundry's commentary because he said that Matthew was midrash, but you can't read a single commentary on Matthew written after like 1997 that at least admits there's midrashic elements at every turn in Matthew's gospel to where you could say it's kind of midrash, but not entirely. But I mean, it may not go as far as Gundry did, but people said that was dangerous at the time, but now it seems like conservative evangelical scholars are saying, here's a midrash element here at this text. And like every other pericope, you're finding evangelical scholars in their Matthew commentaries saying midrash, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The way I see it, Jonathan, is kind of like there's a spectrum. Okay. So my dad, he was a good man, but he had a very rigid view of truth and hermeneutics. So he believed, I asked him once, because he hated the thing that I proposed about Matthew's raised saints. And I said to him once when we were discussing, I said, Dad, what about the parable of the prodigal son? He says, well, that really happened. I said, so you believe that there was the prodigal son was a historical person? Yes. And if he wasn't, then that's a lie. It's a lie in there. Parables, they're true, and those people really existed. I said, okay. Well, so if you're looking, I mean, so if you look at the spectrum, maybe you look, I'm seeing myself on this. So let's see, far right over here, you're going to interpret everything in this wooden literal sense. And then over here on the far left, it's like, well, none of this, it's all, or all of it is invented. None of it, it's like the black of the Jesus Seminar, the black bead of the Jesus Seminar. There's a lot in between on the spectrum. And everybody, like for my dad, anything that was to the left of where he was dangerous. And I think where Elisa is here and where John is they're not over that far, but they're here, and they're certainly to the right of where I am, wherever that is on the spectrum. They're to the right of where I am, so you're going to think that everything to the right of that is going to be dangerous. Most of us are going to think, wherever you are on the spectrum, that anything to the right of that is going to be dangerous if you're conservative. Now, if you are progressive, you're going to think that anything to the right of you is mistaken and dangerous and leading down the wrong path, right? It's kind of like that old slippery slope thing. We all think that we are at the top of the slope, don't we?
So your dad consigns them to the same flames that you would be consigned to as far as he's concerned. There's really no functional difference. You're both all leftists, right? Even Childers of West are leftists because they said they paraphrased Jesus.
Yeah, and my dad would have thought that John West was way down that slippery slope because being part of the Discovery Institute, they adopt an old Earth creation. They don't take Genesis in a literal sense. The Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. They take it as billions of years old, so they're already halfway down that slope.
Yeah, my theory is everyone to my left is a heretic. So if you need a Northern Star for truth,
You're moderate and everybody else is crazy, right?
Hey, I want to say one more thing about the slippery slope.
Yeah.
Hills have more than one slope. And so it is true that you could be like a Bart Ehrman. You start down that slippery slope and you end out at the bottom at some point. But there's another side to that slope. And that could be where traditional inerrantist is. And that side of the slope is a lot steeper. The grade is a lot steeper. So all of a sudden you're a traditional inerrantist. There can be no errors in the Bible whatsoever. And then once you come across something that doesn't seem to jibe with your doctrine of biblical inerrancy, you go tumbling down at a lot faster rate than you would if you were on the slippery slope on the other side. So we all think we're at the top of the slope, but a lot of times it's the very arch conservatives. They go tumbling down faster because their side of the slope, the grade is a lot steeper.
You're muted, Jonathan.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to Bart Ehrman. But that's how people like it when I'm muted. But what I wanted to point out, what they mentioned was your redefinition of inerrancy is something that they had brought up in that clip. And so, and of course, that makes you more dangerous than Enns or the other guy they mentioned, or at least to West, you're more concerning. So I'm curious, do you redefine inerrancy, or is it a matter of people taking inerrancy and then inserting, well, my interpretations are inerrant rather than the text being inerrant, or at least the original manuscripts or wherever it's.
I'd say both. I have a different way of defining inerrancy than what Elisa or John has. But it is also true that as Michael Bird, evangelical New Testament scholar and member of the Evangelical Theological Society, pointed out, they preach the inerrancy of the Bible, but practice the inerrancy of their interpretations.
Yeah.
So both of what you said is true, but I defined inerrancy as the Bible is inerrant in what it teaches. It's inerrant in its message. And the reason I say that, Jonathan, is because even Norman Geisler, who you don't get much more conservative in your belief in inerrancy than Norman Geisler. And I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense. I'm just saying as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
His legacy is biblical inerrancy and the Chicago Statement. And in his big book of Bible difficulties, he acknowledges that there are errors in our present text. And so just like the Chicago Statement says, inerrancy only applies to the autographs. So they are already acknowledging that our current Bible has errors in it. So I make a couple of observations. Could God have preserved an inerrant text? Yes, of course. An all-powerful God could have preserved an inerrant text, but he didn't. So he must not have thought it was important for us to have an inerrant text. So it seems to me that some people are putting more weight on biblical inerrancy than God does. And that's not a good position to be in.
Well, that's what I always point out. I consider myself an inerrantist, and I came up with the Facebook statement on inerrancy that I think you co-signed, and I think Michael Bird co-signed, and Adam Hardwood and David, and like conservative Southern Baptists, they all said, yeah, I like that. And it was the Bible is inerrant in everything that it says in the ways it intended to say it. Mm-hmm. Just left it at that. And we could fight over what it intended to say. That's hermeneutics, that's exegesis, whatever. But I believe that the Bible is inerrant in everything that it says the way it intended to say it. And as far as like the inerrant autographs or the autographic text, wherever it's duplicated in the copies, I think inerrancy is less important than inspiration and authority. I think those two things are far more important, because I can write inerrant documents all day long.
Leather lung, red-faced evangelist over here starting to get uncomfortable.
No, I could write inerrant books all day long if I really wanted to write inerrant books, and they don't mean anything, right? So the author of this book is Jonathan Pritchett. That's an inerrant statement.
Well, and Norman Geisler himself used to say you could get a few English professors together, English majors together, and you could write a paragraph and ensure that it has no errors in it, and then put one word on each page and make a book out of that, and you've got an inerrant book. or
Yeah.
maybe some math dissertations are inerrant because they have to be in order for the right answer to come out or something, but so can a man write an inerrant book? Yeah. But he would then follow by saying, but we're not claiming that men wrote an inerrant book. We're claiming that men under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit wrote an inerrant book. But like you say, he still didn't hold that what we have today has no errors in it because of the process. Real quick, I just want to say Dr. Tim Stratton here says Mike's book helped a good friend of mine from going down the right side of the slope. His faith was almost lost, but he told me that Mike's book saved his faith. So just to say there's a balance here, and there are people whose faith has been strengthened because of this.
Amen.
And then I want to ask this on behalf of Amber. Can someone define error in this conversation? Mike, what would you say amounts to error? I guess that would depend on one's doctrine of inerrancy, right?
Yeah, it's well, we know that if you say that there was one angel at the tomb when there were two, that would be an error if you're saying there was only one angel at the tomb. But then you got to say, well, what if John did with the last sayings of Jesus on the cross what Dan Wallace suggested? Would that be an error? Well, you look at the genre, right? And I'd say, no, that's not an error. It's not an error. It wasn't an error when the psalmist accuses God of sleeping. God wasn't sleeping. We understand what the psalmist is saying, though. Or how about Mark chapter 1, verse 5, when it says, Mark says that the entire region of Judea and everyone living in Jerusalem went out to see John the Baptist and were baptized by him. Now, certainly that is not true in a correspondence sense in terms of being literally every detail that being true, because Mark is speaking in hyperbolic terms. Certainly not everyone in Jerusalem, not all the members of the Sanhedrin and the high priest himself went to see John the Baptist or were baptized by him. But we understand what Mark was saying there. He was using hyperbole. And so the essence of what Mark makes a statement that's essentially faithful to the truth there, but not in a precise detail sense. So we could say the same thing about John's gospel. If what Dan Wallace is saying is true, and if what many Johannine scholars are saying about the I am statements is true, that Jesus said something like this, and the thought is of what Jesus said is being communicated, but not those words, well, then that's truth. That's not an error in that kind of sense. It's more like in a portrait sense rather than a photograph sense. So I think we just have to be careful about what we're saying an error is. What I find with some of those who want to disagree with me, they often will say, well, Mike doesn't believe in a correspondence theory of truth. Correspondence theory of truth, does what's being said correspond to reality? Well, does Mark 1:5 correspond to reality? Yes, as long as you understand the hyperbolic sense of it, right?
Yeah, well, we need to move on with the rest of the video and be done. But I do want to ask you this. Would you say that it's true, Mike, that with what I have in the Gospels of Jesus, that it is possible for a believer to understand? I mean, obviously, we can't totally know the mind of God, but insofar as he wanted us to understand, we can understand the teaching of Jesus and claim to know Jesus from reading the text. And of course, part of that is a theological question.
Yeah, I do believe that. In fact, this goes back to inerrancy and inspiration. I would say to the person who takes the traditional inerrantist view, I'd say, look, you already acknowledge that there are errors in the originals. I'm sorry, in our present Bible. And in fact, we'll go back to Elisa's statement, and she's saying, but most people, they're going to have problems with this. Well, most people in the pews who are evangelicals or in conservative church are going to have problems when you tell them that there are errors in their present Bible. They're not even aware of that. Mm-hmm. And if you say, well, inerrancy only applies to the autographs, they're going to have problems with that. Again, it's where are you on the spectrum and what you're willing to accept at that point. So,
and that's certainly true of like the second half of Mark 16 or the woman caught in adultery.
Oh, They're going to have problems with that. So, I lost my train of thought. Oh,
I'm
so
sorry.
inerrancy and inspiration. Yeah. So they're already going to have problems with you saying inerrancy only applies to the autographs. But if you're saying that there are errors in our present Bible, I would say to them, why do you even have trust in our Bible then? And the answer would probably be, well, because the errors that we know are small ones. Yep, but that's the errors that we've caught, right? And the reason that we are able to catch a lot of those errors is because there's a parallel text. 1 Samuel says David killed Goliath. 2 Samuel says Elhanan killed Goliath. That's a contradiction. What's going on there? Well, Geisler and Howe say it's a copyist error. It should be the brother of Goliath. Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath. And there are a number of different possible explanations for that. Anyway, if we didn't have 1 Samuel, we would today be believing that Elhanan killed Goliath. So the fact is that most places in the Bible don't have a parallel text. So are we to think that they only have errors where a parallel text is involved? Well, of course not. So there are probably errors in our Bible that we haven't caught and will never catch. But they're there and you'll never know it. So why do we trust our present Bible? Because since Jesus rose from the dead, we are confident that God in his sovereignty has preserved everything he wants for us to know with sufficient accuracy. Sufficient accuracy. And that applies to a flexible view of inerrancy as well. The only real difference between my view of inerrancy and the traditional view of inerrancy is whether the autograph is not the current text, it's whether the autographs were inerrant. And we don't have them.
All right, Jonathan, play the video. Let's keep going.
The proposed solutions, I was like, this might be really cool. I'd heard him interviewed a couple of times, and I started to read the book, and for a couple of things I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But then I'm reading like, oh, okay, wait, what? It can still be inerrant but actually lie? That doesn't make sense. And so I really appreciate, because you're one of the very, very few people who have really had the courage to say, we have to at least put up a big stop sign on this thing. And I would never suggest we shut down debates, but we have to consider the weight of what we're debating. And I'm not really seeing that.
And there aren't enough people rising to the occasion to debate it. They're just allowing him to, hold court. And I think, I feel I don't personally know Mike Licona, but I've read his interviews of how he struggled with doubts about the faith through the years, and I have great compassion for that, but again, you also have to think about, and I think some of his friends are thinking, well, they're compassionate toward him, but you're not being compassionate to him if he's going in a unhealthy direction, but you're also not being compassionate about the people who are going to struggle or be led away from the faith because of this view. And I just think that is something that I wish some of his friends would actually more, take up. And let me say something else. I do subscribe to a traditional view of inerrancy, but I want to point out that, there were people like C.S. Lewis and others who didn't fully agree, and Lydia McGrew wouldn't identify with inerrancy.
Yeah, she's not even an inerrantist. That's interesting, huh?
And so my point is that even if you're listening here and you think, well, maybe there are some errors in something you do, but what he's proposing is so far out, that you can't trust virtually anything. If they change the events, like you mentioned, the secondary resurrection of the saints that Matthew records, that was always considered historical by the church. So you create completely new events. You so paraphrase things that you're not really paraphrasing. You're creating complete new sayings of Jesus. You're changing the location, the timing. This is not even this isn't C.S. Lewis. This isn't even people who say, well, there are some minor errors or something. This is like a frontal assault, whatever he says. I'm not saying psychologically he's sold himself that he's sort of defending the faith, but in reality, in objective reality, this is so different from the, historic Christian teaching. And it's what, like Lydia McGrew says, he does these unforced errors.
Can you put on pause?
Very.
So I'd say, John, just read what Johannine scholars are saying today. Read what evangelical Johannine scholars are. You'll learn a lot if you do that. And I would
say, it's important you say evangelical scholars, because he does. I think he says in this video Mike maybe too opened up to these secular historians or scholars.
Not just Yoni scholars, just conservative evangelical.
Yeah, but Mike, you had a flow going there.
Read Bach,
Gnostic
Anderson,
scholars.
Keener, Blomberg, Bruce. Read these guys. Carson. Read their commentaries on John. Read their books on John. Read Blomberg's recent book, Jesus the Purifier, and the stuff about John in there. Read his book, The Historical Reliability of John's Gospel, and I think that would be really helpful for him. And he said that there's no one that's rising up who will debate me. Well, hey, John, I'm here. Let's have a friendly public discussion on this. I'm open to it. Let's do it.
Be happy to host that right here on Trinity Radio.
Yeah, depending on what it pays, I'll debate you on something. I'll find something.
You
Then go
grifter.
guns afterwards.
Well, she also said there, that was the part where she said that when she was reading your book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? She thought, okay, well, now that seems to fit. That seems right, or whatever she said. And then she said, but wait a minute, hold on. Are you telling me that this can be in the Bible, but also a lie? And again, just want to emphasize, no, that would be to misunderstand what Mike is saying. Mike is just saying that they might be doing something that you didn't expect. That doesn't mean they're lying. That means they're doing something differently, or they're in error, or they're lying. It just means they're operating under the conventions of a genre that's not the one you assumed.
And it's a fairly black and white approach to things, So the way I've articulated it in the past is, this is the way it is in my marriage, and it's stereotypical. There are many exceptions to it, but let's face it. There's the way guys tell stories, and there's the way girls tell stories, and they are often different. I like bullet points, just get to the bottom line. I will sometimes bend the details so that I don't have to go through 5 minutes of background knowledge in order to communicate something to you, Braxton, that you really don't care about that. You just want the bottom line. Whereas my wife will be in the background saying, it didn't happen that way. And, she wants everything in the proper order and the exact details and what that person was wearing and the precise words that they said. And so it's not that I'm lying. That's not what's going on. It's just I'm abbreviating. I'm getting to the bottom line. When Matthew says that the cleansing of the temple happened on Sunday rather than Monday, he's not lying. He's simplifying his account by abbreviating. When Matthew has the centurion himself go to Jesus to ask Jesus to heal his servant, rather than as Luke has it, he sends Jewish leaders and then servants out there. Matthew is not lying. He's just simplifying. When Mark has Jairus goes out and say, my daughter's about to die, please come heal her. And they start heading back. And then the servants come and say, don't trouble the teacher anymore. Your daughter is now dead. And Jesus says, don't worry, just have faith. Matthew is not lying when he has Jairus goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, my daughter has just died. Please come and heal her. And then they go back and Jesus raises her from the dead, and no servants come out and intercept to say that his daughter's died because she's already dead. Matthew is simplifying these things. He's not lying. This is the kind of stuff we do in our everyday, ordinary conversations. We don't consider it to be deceit. These are just our ways of communicating.
Yeah, just in the same way that if an amanuensis is composing and arranging an epistle on behalf of the author, it doesn't mean that Paul wasn't the author, because the amanuensis even may have added some flair and flourish to it. In the same way, in the ancient world, if clients of the synagogue were going to speak on behalf of the centurion, it's as good as the centurion authorized it. And so it's essentially speaking to the centurion himself. In the minds of ancient people, they don't make those kind of like, oh, you're lie. Matthew's lying here. Luke got it right. That's not. None of that goes on in the ancient world to the original audience. That's not.
It's just a rigid way of thinking.
Yeah.
All right, let's finish it out, Pritchett.
All right.
A few hard things that we don't quite know how to reconcile, maybe, but the things he's talking about are not those things.
Right.
I mean,
right.
The fact that Jesus says, the different accounts focus on different things he's saying is not contradictory.
Right.
The idea that simple statements, I mean, he raises questions about the historicity of really simple statements like, I am the light of the world. Well, if anything can be virtually verbatim, it would be those simple declarative statements, because that will stick in your mind. So it's like he's searching for a problem, in many cases, a solution to a problem that doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well, and I think what we all need to be willing to do is, of course, in love, but speak truth and I think also one thing that can keep people from speaking out necessarily, and I've experienced a little bit of this, as much as I've tried to insulate myself from joining bigger groups. I've tried, I always say I'm not a joiner, because I see people go off cliffs together because they won't challenge each other. And so I typically won't come under the umbrella of something else. Of course, I'm accountable to my pastors and my husband and my family and other people in my life. But I think I have a little bit more freedom to do things like that. But I've lost I've lost people. I've been uninvited to events. I've lost people who have worked advocating for me because of calling out things that maybe got a little too close to their person that they like. And I think we all have to be willing to be uninvited to things. We have to be willing as Christians to even lose our jobs if necessary, to speak truth. And even sadly, I mean, you don't want to lose relationships, but a true friend, someone who really loves somebody else, will speak truth to them. And so I appreciate you bringing this out. Now, certainly, this is not the case, what we're about to talk about with
Let it roll. Let it roll. Let it roll just a second longer.
As far as I know, he still completely holds to a biblical sexual ethic. But very often, when people do redefine inerrancy or inspiration, as in the case of Pete Enns, it's the whole sexuality conversation will come next.
Okay.
And you call it sexual suicide in your book.
Yeah. So now there's a point there, Mike. Like I'm glad she's clear that you are conservative on these sexual ethics and a lot of these cultural issues that are out there right now. You're very conservative on all of that. But Mike, once you open up inerrancy, it definitely is possible that people may find ways to reinterpret passages in a way that not only affects doctrine, but also allows for some of these woke sort of ideas and things like that. Are you presenting a view that allows for that sort of thing?
I suppose it could. I don't know that people really need that, though. There are enough people holding a traditional view of inerrancy who are unethical and have fallen into sexual sin. I mean, recently you look at Michael Tate, right? Unfortunately, he has come out and repented. I look at Michael Brown, who has not really shown the kind of repentance that a lot of us would have liked to have seen. I look at Ravi Zacharias. He held a very strict form of biblical inerrancy, Chicago Statement. I look at him living a double life. I look at Johnny Hunt, the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention and former pastor of First Baptist Church of Woodstock, and accused of sexual sin. I look at Paige Patterson, who was involved in the Chicago Statement of biblical inerrancy, its formation, and how he got fired from his job because of abuse of women. So,
but Mike, there is a difference between someone knowing what Scripture says or says directly or indirectly about those sorts of things, and then just doing it anyway, and having a hermeneutic that allows them to thump the pulpit and say, "Thus saith the Lord," about woke ideas in a way that's permissive of them. Yeah. But what I'm looking at your model, and I've read your works. I've talked to you many, many times about this. We've spent time together, and I don't know how that would work with this, with your understanding. In other words, your understanding still comes out, as far as I can tell, with the same didactic teachings. All things being equal. So I'm not even sure how that criticism applies.
There are people with West's view and Childers' view of inerrancy who will go to Romans 1, right? Or they'll go to passages about Sodom and Gomorrah. They have the same view of inerrancy, and yet they try to reinterpret that so they can find the wiggle room for their sexual ethics that are contrary to the traditional interpretations of those, even by liberal scholars who reject inerrancy, who reject Christianity, say, or probably even homosexual, who are saying yeah, the Bible condemns our lifestyle. You know, there are conservative, inerrantists who still try to find the way to reinterpret certain passages. So I don't think that his view of inerrancy really lends itself to that, when there people with their own view of inerrancy are finding ways to reinterpret certain biblical passages.
Yeah, I think I agree. And it gets back to, everybody thinks they stand at the top of the slope, right? They're at the top of the hill. And if you have a view that's a little less conservative than theirs, then you've already started down that hill. That's problematic. And it's like, okay, I acknowledge that, there could be someone who is, really a traditional inerrantist, very conservative, and they see some of these things that troubles them, and if they accept it, then they just want to throw out all of Scripture. But that's because they went too far. They're interpreting what I'm saying as John is proposing, not as I'm proposing. And if you're going to say, well, but if you take that view, the problem with that is you might start down on a route that you eventually lose your faith or go into progressive Christianity. I'd say, well, now you're acting like a Pharisee, because you're not just looking at truth now. You want to build a hedge around that truth that you can't go past, so that if you pass that, then it's possible for you to sin. So you don't want to be a Pharisee. Look, I'm after truth. I'm out to see, what does the text actually teach here, so we can follow it. So earlier I mentioned one of the principles I teach my students. Our view of Scripture should be consistent with what we observe in Scripture. So now I want to give you the second principle I give them, and here it is. If we truly want to have a high view of Scripture, then we must embrace it as God has given it to us, rather than forcing it to fit a mold of how we think he should have. And if we neglect in doing this, we may think we have a high view of Scripture, when in reality, we have a high view of our view of Scripture.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have a couple of things I wanted to get to. I didn't want to ask in the middle of the discussion because, but they are relevant to this, I think. One of those is from Leaving the Matrix, off topic, and maybe you don't know how to answer this or want to answer this, Mike, but off topic. But what is the latest on people saying Habermas inflated his references or citations? So would love to hear your thoughts in his new books.
Well, thanks for calling me Gary Jr. I'll call that. I'll take that as a high compliment. To be honest, I don't know. I know Lydia McGrew, I've heard. I didn't see it, but someone told me that she accuses Gary of that very thing, inflating his references or citations, or saying that a scholar said something when they really didn't. I don't know. I haven't checked that. I have moved away largely from resurrection studies to go to stuff with the Gospels. That's where I'm spending my time. I do know this, that all scholars, myself included, we make mistakes. And when you're doing something with so many different references, so many different sources that you are reading and studying and taking notes on, there's always going to be some mistakes. My recent book, Jesus Contradicted, that took 3 years to write. After spending 8 years on the first book on it, then I spent an additional 3 years on this next book. And so I wrote it, I went through it several times, and then I gave it to my wife, Debbie, and she read it and found all kinds of errors that I'd made in it, spelling and awkward grammar and duplicates and things like this. And so she gives this to me and I correct it, and then I read it, and then I find more. And then I turn it over and I pay a professional editor that I've used several times in the past. He's fantastic. And I pay him, go through this, find all the errors that you can. And he did, and gives it back to me. And it's like, whoa, man, that's a bunch of them. And so I correct that. And then I read through it again and I find errors that no one else has found. And finally, I give it over to Zondervan, and they give it to, first of all, my acquisitions editor there, who's a VP, and she finds a bunch of errors in it. And then it gets turned over to 2 more reviewers. They find errors in it. They correct it all. They send it to me. I read through. I find some more errors in it. And then, I mean, this is typical of the editing process, folks. And then you give it back to the publisher. They publish it. And then when it came out, I read it and I found numerous minor errors in it that have been corrected for like the next edition. I mean, they're not big stuff. They're just, little things. That to say, if that can happen in a book that after 11 years of research and about 250 pages of this, think about how many of those things you're going to find with less editing done and about 5,000 pages in it. You're just going to have a bunch of those kinds of things. It's going to happen.
Right. Okay. The last thing I'm going to hit you with, Mike, and then you can say whatever you want, and then we'll let you go. But Chris Stockman asks, am I the only one baffled at the hullabaloo over Licona, who is not an errantist, rather than over McGrew, who is an errantist? Response?
Yeah, that's something that has really, I found it baffling. You had someone like Norman Geisler, who just endorsed and encouraged Lydia McGrew, who denies inerrancy. While I affirm it, I may not take as strict a view of it as Geisler did, but I still affirmed inerrancy. Whereas McGrew outright denies it. What's interesting is New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. I was banned from speaking at the conference there for now over a decade. I used to speak at their annual apologetics conference. I was banned and never invited back, even though I still affirmed inerrancy. But then they would invite Tim and Lydia McGrew to speak there annually. Every year, Tim speaks there, and he denies inerrancy. So it really doesn't make sense. But, let's face it, all of us are guilty at times of being inconsistent. We're just inconsistent. We're selective in the things that, we show outrage over, and we're just inconsistent. Unfortunately, it's an unfortunate fact. And I think this is the way it is with some folks when it comes to Lydia not being an inerrantist and me still embracing inerrancy, at least in some sense, in terms of the message that is being communicated. But, so you go outside the U.S. and North America, and what you find is a lot of conservative Christians. Inerrancy isn't a thing for them. Infallibility. They want to know what the Bible teaches is true. They don't get hung up over small details.
Well, Mike, we've kept you for nearly 2 hours now. Is there anything else you want to say in terms of wrapping up? I'm sure we want to reaffirm that we think that we're talking about the 2 people in the video, a brother and sister in Christ, who are probably, as we say, godly people who have good motivations, who do see, abuses and dangers out there. We just disagree about this issue. Is there anything else you want to say on that?
Well, I echo what you just said, Braxton. Mm-hmm. I don't know Elisa. I don't know John. I don't know that I've ever met either of them, but I agree with you. I'm sure. I'm not even really familiar with each of their ministries, although I know that they each have good ministries. But, I'm just siloed in New Testament kind of stuff. And I just don't allow myself to get distracted by other issues. So, I'm sure they're just great people, and I just wish them the best. I met Elisa this year and spent about 20 minutes talking with her, and it was pleasant. It felt like, from my end anyway, it felt like I was talking to a sister in Christ and all of that. So I hope this isn't taken as a hostile or aggressive thing, just an opportunity for Mike to clarify his position. Mm-hmm. Jonathan, are you still alive out there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't get what the alarmism is about. I don't even see Dr. Licona being anywhere near either Stanley or Peter Enns, for that matter. Mike Licona, I think, likes the Old Testament, so reads it on occasion. So I don't need to unhitch. So I don't get that. I don't get the alarmism about methodology, and it goes back to what Dr. Lacona said at the very beginning of this program, which is any number of New Testament commentaries by evangelical conservative scholars has, to some degree or other, all of this material. Like Lacona is not doing anything brand new in that sense. There's a lot of different takes out there on how to understand different things in the gospel using literary devices, using even harmonization or whatever. There's just a lot of this stuff going around.
Well, as someone said, Jonathan, in the chat, William Lane Craig, I heard this from William Lane Craig, not maybe with all of the intricacy that Mike has from studying the classicalist stuff, but like saying that about Matthew 27, that, well, this could have been a literary device. I'm not sure how he said it, but he implied that. I heard that probably circa 2009, listening to a debate between he and, I don't remember if it was Bart Ehrman or Richard Carrier or one.
Yeah, that would be a year before the book was published. I don't know if Dr. Craig saw a prior manuscript or the original dissertation. Don't know. He might have got it. I don't. You say it goes older than that, though, don't you, Dr. Lacona, with William Lane Craig? As far as
there are others who have held to that for a while.
Yeah.
What I will say too, New Testament, evangelical New Testament scholars have acknowledged the use of various kinds of compositional devices that change the way, that change details and things like that. What my work has added to that, and what is new in it, it has taken the compositional devices that are discussed by the compositional textbooks that were being taught to people when they learned how to read and write, or when they learned how to write. That was to be used in professional writing, and that classicists acknowledge across the board that ancient biographers used. And I apply that to the Gospels because there are ancient biographies of Jesus, and say that, this explains why we have a lot of these differences. They're not contradictions. They're not due to poor historical work on the part of the Gospel authors. These were things that were prescribed and part and parcel of just how you would write ancient biographies. And then in the recent book, Jesus Contradicted, by the way, I don't really like that title. It's what Zondervan chose. It's to kind of almost reflect Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted. I wanted a different title, Reading the Gospels for the First Time Again. But they didn't like that, and that's okay. But,
yeah, I like their title better.
The stuff that's also new, a contribution, is my chapters on inspiration and inerrancy. I come and I say, let's re-examine these doctrines. I think we need to get a better understanding of what it means to say the Bible is divinely inspired, and what it means to say it's inerrant, because our view of inspiration begets our view of inerrancy. So if you have a faulty view of inspiration, it's going to result in a faulty view of inerrancy. And what I find interesting is, Bill Craig and I had been really looking into this unbeknownst to one another, independently looking into these two issues simultaneously. And in his new volume 1 of his philosophical systematic theology, he comes to a lot of the same kind of conclusions, very similar conclusions about inspiration and inerrancy that I do. So it'll be interesting to see how people respond to that.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Well, as we go, I just wanted to encourage you a little bit. Alfonso Hayden says, Mike's work has helped me tremendously. And Josh Klein says, Dr. Lacona's work has been extremely beneficial for my walk and my work. When I had a crisis of faith in the mid-2000s, it was his work along with Craig's that helped steady my faith. Mike, we've had a wonderful time with you here today, and always thrilled with an opportunity to chat with you. We talk somewhat regularly, and I always look forward to it. We've been friends for, I guess, probably 16 years or something, but I told him just yesterday, I said, I still feel starstruck when I talk to you because I just admire you so much. And that's not just because of your work. That's because I've seen in you a person of consistent character and a consistent passion for truth. And I admire that and want that for my own life. Thanks for being with us today.